Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Andy Anders, back in the home studio for this week's episode as we prepare for the biggest game of the season to date, and maybe the entire regular season, not just for Ohio State, but in all of college football, as this is a number 2 versus number 3 matchup. Ohio State and Oregon, both undefeated, the two projected frontrunners. This is what we thought this game was going to be when we talked about it before the season. This is the game. We've had it circled on our calendar. Even the likes of Ryan Day and Will Howard have acknowledged now that they've had this game circled on their calendar. We've talked about that ramp up. It's been kind of a gradual ramp up here. And now the ramp goes like this. And now this is where we are really going to get our first look at whether this Ohio State football team is a championship caliber team.
Yeah, to extend the allegory probably too far, you're going to go off the ramp here at kickoff, and either you're going to take flight, and if Ohio State wins this game, I mean, it'd take a collapse for them not to make the college football playoff, I would think, if you win this game, or you come back down to earth a little bit. Not to say things crash if you lose this game. You can definitely afford to lose this game and still obtain all the goals you set out to achieve. It'll hurt your Big Ten title odds, but you can still absolutely beat Michigan, easily make the college football playoff, win a national title, those things. But this is honestly the biggest part of this is that it's the measuring stick and the ramp of you're now seeing what it looks like against a real team who's another national title contender. And Oregon, you look at the roster and what they've done this year. I know some people might scoff at the Boise State or Idaho scores. Boise State's a really good team, but this is a team that throughout its roster has a much more complete set of talent than any team Ohio State has played so far. I think most people would acknowledge that, but I think just in diving into this game and this matchup, there are a lot of areas where Oregon is going to challenge Ohio State and test a lot of the improvements we've seen in key areas throughout the early stretch of the season here. So as you enter this game, I think there's reason to have a lot of confidence if you're an Ohio State fan in the strides that have been taken in the way they've looked these first 5 games, because you can only play who you play. They can't help their schedule. But also, plenty of reasons to also be concerned given how good this Oregon team is.
Because it's not just Ohio State that's made strides, right? This Oregon team, I think, has clearly made strides too. And I think if you're sleeping on this Oregon team because of the first 2 weeks, then you've probably missed the way they've played the last few weeks. And granted, they haven't played any world beaters, but neither has Ohio State. Maybe the best analogy you can draw between these two teams is them both playing Michigan State. And Ohio State beat Michigan State 38-7. Oregon beat Michigan State 31-10. Ohio State's win a little bit more convincing, coming at Michigan State in East Lansing. So if you're going to do a head-to-head comparison, Ohio State would come out in front here. But then you factor in the fact that Ohio State's got to fly across the country to go play in this game and to go play at Autzen Stadium, where Oregon is 31-1 since 2019. If you just look at the last 3 weeks, Big Ten teams have played 10 games where they had to travel across 2 time zones to play in 2 or more time zones to play in that game. Ohio State will have 3 this week. Big Ten teams are 0-10 in those games over the last 3 weeks. And so there's always the question of how much does home field really matter? And, ultimately this is going to come down to the players on the field and who's the better football team. But I do think when you add that factor into this game for Ohio State, it just increases the difficulty level that much more, going up against a team that is, without a doubt, the most capable of challenging this Ohio State team than anyone they've played so far this year.
Before we dive fully into the Oregon matchup, just a few more notes on the Iowa game, because there were some key things that are trends that are going to help Ohio State entering this Oregon matchup, I think. And I kind of hinted earlier at Ohio State taking strides in key areas. I think the number one question we both had entering the season was the offensive line. I think probably the number one question Ohio State fans had entering the season was the offensive line. And as much as you can take from these first 5 games against some lesser competition, the offensive line has shown everything I think you wanted to see from them. Ohio State's been able to run the ball successfully. They've protected Will Howard great, only 4 sacks allowed on the season. And some of that credit, of course, goes to the Chip Kelly scheme, goes to Will Howard able to escape the pressure in a few spots. But only 11 teams in the country, including Ohio State, have allowed that few sacks or less on the season. And just qualitatively, right, as someone who loves offensive line play, watching this line work, Seth McLaughlin has been such a massive boost game in, game out to what they do. Like Ryan Day has said in the past, he's like having a pro there at center, really setting the tone, setting the productions, setting the assignments. Tegra Shabola was really impressive in this last game. I think there's a reason Austin Sierraveld was working in with that right guard mix. It's the first time since Sierraveld was starting at left guard we've seen Tegra eat up all of those first team snaps at the position. And it's because he was able to hold his mustard against a really, really good defensive tackle tandem that Iowa has, get that push off the line. I think Josh Fryer, while I still have some concerns entering this week, given how good Oregon's defensive ends are, has shown again that he's excellent in the run game, at the very least, and has maybe taken some steps as a pass protector again. Bigger tests to come this weekend specifically. The left side, though, I would put that left side up against most of the rest of college football in terms of the offensive line. Donovan Jackson, on the whole, has been among the nation's elite guards, I think, since his return. And Josh Simmons has taken that next step that he needed, has always been a freakish athlete at the position. He's a fantastic second-level blocker, and I think Ohio State's used that in some spaces in the running game, but also a guy that he has the strength to win on the line of scrimmage and the athleticism to protect the edge very well. So this offensive line has come together through 5 weeks in a way that I think I didn't anticipate even, but everything you wanted to see from this offensive line you have so far, with the caveat that this is the toughest challenge they'll have faced so far.
But Iowa was the toughest challenge that offensive line had faced so far in comparison to the first month, and they went out and rushed for 200 yards against a defense that hadn't allowed more than 100 rushing yards in a game all year. So I think, that was a real test for the offensive line, and I think the offensive line passed that test. And so I think there's definite reason to go into this game with some real confidence in this offensive line, to believe that this offensive line is legitimately better than it was a year ago. Now, like you said, I do think this is going to be another ramp up in terms of a test. And I think a lot of that has to do with how dynamic this Oregon team is at defensive end, particularly Jordan Birch. He's a guy who was just named the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week, was really dominant in that game against Michigan State last week. You look at his stats on the year, in just 5 games, he already has 7 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, 4 pass breakups. So this is a guy who has the potential to wreak havoc off the edge, and Chip Kelly touched on that during his press conference on Tuesday.
So special.
Yeah, I think his athletic ability for such a big player, he's listed at 6'5", 290, but he plays defensive end. Most guys that big are the interior defensive linemen, so he's a really athletic guy. And, he had a huge game against Michigan State last Friday night, and really kind of showed up. I think he's really starting to embrace that role that Tosh and Dan have put him in. And, you got to know where he is on every play, but he's one of those guys that can disrupt the football game.
I think, based on what we've seen this year, but I think Ohio State's offensive line can hold its own against this Oregon defensive front. But, I still have my questions. Okay. If Josh Fryer is going to be blocking Jordan Birch the whole game, is he going to be able to consistently win that matchup against a guy who's as explosive, as gifted as Jordan Birch? And it's not just him. They have Mateo Uiagalelei, who, people who follow Ohio State recruiting will remember that was a battle that came down to the wire before he chose Oregon over Ohio State. They've also got, again, another really good defensive tackle tandem, Derek Harmon, who's a Michigan State transfer. That's a guy who Ohio State wanted. They wanted him out of a transfer portal. And I think we can see why, based on some of the defensive tackle depth issues that Ohio State has had so far this year. He's a guy who could have helped Ohio State as probably that first defensive tackle off the bench this year. Instead, he's a guy they're now going to have to reckon with when they go to Oregon this week.
Precisely. And that's where, again, I think the challenge is a step up from other games for this offensive line, is specifically in the pass rush area. Or Iowa's going to be one of the best run defenses in the country, and that you pass that with flying colors, I think, especially in that first half, 7.3 yards per carry. But this Oregon defensive front, and really all three of the tests that Ohio State is going to, the biggest games Ohio State has on its regular season schedule, Oregon, Penn State, Michigan, all three of those defensive fronts can really get after the quarterback. And so I think this is going to be a good measuring stick even for those games. But focusing here, Derek Harmon too, a guy that Ohio State was after in the transfer portal for a little bit, can rush the passer from the 3-tech D-tackle position, has 3 sacks on the year to go with the 3.5 Uyunglele has and the 5 that Birch has. And so you can't really shade to Birch and maybe like try and give additional help from your 5-man protection schemes in those sets, because those other guys are real dangerous factors too. You might have to think about leaving a tight end if Josh Fryer does start struggling, leaving an extra protector in there to help give some extra time. And of course, Dan Lanning is also a very creative defensive mind, and that is going to play a role in maybe how Oregon tries to pressure and attack Ohio State. So that, I think, to your point, Dan, they've shown they can run the ball consistently, and it's an area where you can maybe exploit this Oregon team who had issues against the run with Ashton Jeanty, Heisman contender. Boise State's rushing offense is really legit, but Ohio State has the best tandem of backs in the country and an offensive line that has shown against one of the nation's best run defenses it can run the ball. So that, I think you look at that matchup and you say, I like where Ohio State is at run blocking. Now this will be a bigger test as far as pass blocking than they've faced so far. Another guy against Iowa who I think it was really important to take that huge step, but will face a new type of challenge this week, is Sonny Styles. Sonny Styles in that Iowa game, to me, was the single most improved player week to week. Some of the issues he had kind of freezing at times against Michigan State, rectified. Now, Iowa, his assignment was kind of very one note, so to speak, where you're expecting Iowa to run the ball. You're expecting Iowa to try and hammer it down the field. And so you could really, there wasn't a whole lot of changing looks to read and react to. Sonny was able to point downfield, get in the backfield, but man, he was a bit of a game wrecker in that, I think, just in his ability to come to the line of scrimmage and meet Caleb Johnson there. 7 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, ties his career high, exceeds his career high. And really certainly the best we've seen Sonny play at linebacker. I think the best defensive performance he's had, period. But again, Terrence Ferguson, Oregon has a tight end this week that is one of the best in college football. And Sonny is going to match up with him in pass coverage on several occasions. I'm sure more than several occasions will probably be the primary matchup for guarding Terrence Ferguson. And so he's going to have to, hold up in coverage, which is something that didn't get tested against Iowa last week, and something Michigan State and Marshall really targeted Ohio State over the middle with these quick passes. But also now the look changes. He's not going to be able to just really be confident in his run diagnosis when Oregon is doing so many different things and has a much more multiple offensive scheme. You don't know if it's the run or the pass or the RPO or what's necessarily coming at you in that sense. And so it's going to be a test of his play recognition and instincts. Have they really evolved, or was it just that he had a simpler assignment against Iowa? And it's going to be a test of his pass coverage skills. But he took massive leaps, certainly in run defense, and I think overall just playing freer, which he talked about after the game.
Yeah, I think the defensive front 6 is certainly coming into this game with a lot of momentum based on how it played against Iowa. You look at what Caleb Johnson was doing going into that game, really outside of a couple of 28-yard runs that he had, one of which came against the backups on defense, the other of which was Cody and Sonny both missed a tackle, and that was, mostly an anomaly. I mean, outside of that, Cody and Sonny were very sure tackling on the day. So it was really just, one bad play by the first team, one bad play by the second team, other than that, Ohio State bottled Caleb Johnson up. They held him to 30 yards on 13 carries. And so I think that is a very encouraging sign for this Ohio State run defense going into this game against Oregon. And I think if you're looking at potential advantages for Ohio State, I think one of them that definitely could prove to be an advantage for Ohio State is that Ohio State defensive line against Oregon's offensive line, because Oregon's offensive line has had some moving parts this year. One of their guys who was a projected starter coming into the year, Matthew Bedford, a transfer from Indiana, he's been battling a knee injury all year, hasn't played much. So they've had some moving parts up there, haven't been, elite in either pass protection or run blocking. And so I think that's one area where Ohio State's defensive line has a chance to potentially have an advantage in this game. Now, I do think there's a couple question marks here. I think one being the depth of the defensive line, particularly at defensive tackle, because you look at the way Ohio State used its defensive line in these first couple Big Ten games. Not a whole lot of rotation, especially at defensive tackle against Iowa with Tyleik Williams back in the lineup. The good news is Tyleik Williams is back. He looked as good as ever. And I think when he was in the game, when Ty Hamilton was in the game, when Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau were in the game, that Ohio State defensive line was largely dominant. I think the question I have this week is, okay, is Ohio State either going to need to lean on those starting defensive tackles for 4 quarters? And if so, are those guys going to be able to hold up and play at that same high level for 4 full quarters? Or can someone behind them step up in a game like this where they're likely going to need to be able to lean on their starting defensive line for 4 quarters? Caden McDonald has flashed, but it still doesn't seem like Ohio State quite trusts him as a guy to play a lot of snaps in big moments. I think there has been a pretty clear drop-off at free tech from Tyleik Williams to the backups there. And, Ryan Day even mentioned it on Tuesday that, that's one reason why Ohio State is using the Rushman package on third downs. Not necessarily that it feels a need to upgrade it interior pass rush over Tyleik Williams, because Tyleik Williams is a really good interior pass rusher, but because they want to maybe take some of those snaps off his plate when they can, because they don't have the depth they really want at pre-tech behind him. And so I think that, that's going to be one question this week, is just with questionable defensive tackle depth, can those guys play at that same sustained level for 4 full quarters if they need to? And then secondly, it goes back to what you said about the linebackers. With the Iowa matchup, I think played very well into Cody Simon and Sonny Styles' strengths, and that I think they're both guys who are at their best when they're able to come downhill and fly up a ball as run defenders. I think the questions you have with those guys come in pass coverage, which maybe not what we expected to say about Sonny Styles as a converted safety, but I think that's where he is right now. I think he's a guy who is better playing forward than he is playing backwards, and I think he's going to get tested more in that area this week. And I also think in general, I mean, Ohio State, we came into this year saying, Ohio State should have the best pass defense in the country. I think it still can have the best pass defense in the country. I don't know if, based on what we've seen the last few weeks, that it has been the best pass defense in the country. And I think in particular, the question I have for this game is that quick underneath passing game something Oregon might be able to exploit? Because you look at Oregon, what it's done for the passing game so far this year, completing 77% of its passes. That's the highest completion percentage in the FBS. This is an Oregon offense. They're going to look to get the ball out quickly. They're going to look to complete those high percentage passes. We've seen Ohio State kind of playing off the ball a lot in coverage, not giving up those big plays, and they've done a really good job of not giving up those big, long, explosive plays. But they have looked a little bit susceptible to that underneath passing game. And this offense is going to really be the first one that can really test that in terms of that ability to turn those short, quick passes into longer gains because of the kind of weapons it has at wide receiver, at running back, even at tight end, like you mentioned. And so I think the run defense, I maybe wouldn't have thought I would be saying this a couple weeks ago, but I think I go into this game more confident actually in the run defense than I do in the pass defense, just because I think the run defense had a really big test last week and they passed it. Whereas I don't think this pass defense has really had a great test yet. And we've seen just enough kind of holes in that makes me think they're going to have to tighten some things up this week against a really dynamic Oregon offense.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. The one thing I'll add is that I'm interested to see the mix between press and off coverage in this game from Jim Knowles, because I feel like you always want to mix, right? You can't just go press every play. You certainly can't go off every play. But I think the balance there has been a little more off heavy than I expected when you have such a highly touted group of defensive backs. And I do think some of the quick game, like Davis Igbinosun, I've seen get some criticism from places in this first handful of weeks. Maybe some of that was set back by the interception he had on Saturday and some other things he did. But to me, I think a lot of the plays that Davison has given up have been when he's in off coverage. And this is a guy who's a physical corner, first and foremost, likes to get his hands on receivers. And also, like, teams are just running those underneath routes underneath the off coverage where you get a quick hitting slant or a hitch or something really fast out route, get the ball out of the quarterback's hands and just take advantage of the fact that the corner is 9 or 10 yards off the ball. That, to me, I think when you're worried about Oregon's quick game as much as you might be and hitting those passes over the middle, maybe Ohio State ramps up the aggression in terms of press. Now, of course, that opens you up to more downfield shots, but if you're trying to limit what Oregon has tried to do this season, what's worked against you this season, and I think you have faith too in Lathan Ransom and Caleb Downs playing deep and cleaning up some of those mistakes if they happen. So that the balance in the scheme that Knowles decides to run with in coverage is going to be interesting to me to follow this year. And I do think there's been some areas he's opened up the playbook at times. I loved the dime package blitz with Lorenzo Styles this weekend. That was although Iowa had a big gain on that play. I think their longest pass of the day, in fact, on that play. Lorenzo gets a big hit on Cade McNamara. And those kinds of things I think are cool to see. Different blitz packages that we maybe haven't seen since the 2022 season. How much of that do you involve? The other thing is, though, I think people haven't realized maybe that Ohio State's been doing a really good job of getting pressure sending 4 in recent weeks, but only when the quarterback holds the ball longer than 2.5 seconds. You know, if he's just going to take a 3-step drop and zip it out of there, you don't have a chance to get after him. And that's what teams are doing a lot to this defense, and what Oregon will try to do a lot to this defense. Again, like we've been saying, the quick passes over the middle. And you can't just focus on the tight end because they have 3 great receivers too. We've touched on it a little bit, but Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, and Evan Stewart. Tez Johnson is going to be a Biletnikoff contender. It feels like he also had a big punt return touchdown, so he's dangerous there, but 395 yards receiving, been very productive for them. Trayshawn Holden, an Alabama transfer, has made some nice highlight reel catches, has been productive. And then Evan Stewart, who had over 1,100 yards combined in 2 seasons at Texas A&M. So these guys, it's a little mix of some former transfers and stuff, and this receiving core is one of the more complete in the country. Obviously, Ohio State's is who you'd have at the top, but Oregon's receiving core, you cannot afford to focus on one area of the field defending the pass because of how many weapons. They have 4 established weapons between the 3 receivers and the tight end. So how you space it out in those one-on-one matchups are also going to be critical in your success defending the pass. And how much is Jim Knowles willing to put guys on an island, play press? Does Ohio State get hurt in those situations? All will be very interesting things to follow against a passing offense that can test you in so many different ways.
I think one thing we can expect is that both both sides of the ball are going to unveil some wrinkles that we haven't seen yet in this game because, I mean, they know. I mean, even though they all say one game at a time and we try not to look ahead. I mean, everybody in the Woody knows, like, this is the game it's all been ramping up to. And I think, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, I felt like it was a pretty vanilla game plan from Chip Kelly last week compared to what we had seen in the first month. And that was probably by design because you're saving some things up for this week. But that makes it all the more impressive that, in a game where I didn't feel like there were quite as many bells and whistles in the run game as there had been in the first 4 games, you still ran for over 200 yards against a really good Iowa defense. And so I think that's encouraging right there that a lot of a game, we were kind of just running straight up run game and you still got 200 yards against a really good defense. Certainly we've seen what these weapons can do for this Ohio State offense. I mean, Emeka Egbuka had maybe the best game of his career against Iowa, catching a career high 3 touchdown passes. Jeremiah continues to steal the show every week, had another spectacular one-handed grab against Iowa, and he's gotten so much of the attention. But Emeka keeps reminding us that, he's an elite wide receiver too, that Ohio State has 2 of the best wide receivers in the country. And I think when you think about reasons to be confident entering a game like this, so much of it starts at the fact that you have Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka at wide receiver, and you have Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins at running back. You talk about Oregon's weapons, but nobody has a better quartet of weapons in college football than Ohio State has in those 4 guys right there. And so that, I think, is something that gives you a lot of confidence going into this game. I think the big question that, I have, that a lot of people have going into this game is Will Howard ready for this moment? Will Howard rise to the occasion and be the guy that Ohio State needs him to be in a game like this, where Ohio State, probably for the first time all year, is going to need him to make big throws in the fourth quarter with the game on the line? Now, again, I think he is also coming into this game with some momentum based on the way he played against Iowa. He had more total touchdowns, 4 passing, 1 rushing, than he had incompletions, 4. He did have the 1 bad interception late in the first half, but I think in the second half of that game, we really saw him get into a rhythm, and really the whole team get into a rhythm. And I think that's another encouraging thing going into this game. Now, Ohio State needs to start faster in this game than it did against Iowa. I mean, in general, outside of a Western Michigan game, Ohio State has been a bit of a slow starter this year. And so I think that's maybe a concerning thing if you're looking into this week's game. But I think the good thing is you feel like even if Ohio State falls into an early hole, like, they're not going to panic. They're not going to fall apart because they've consistently shown, especially coming out of halftime. I mean, they're 84-3 in the third quarter this year. They rank very near the top of the country in both points scored and points allowed in the third quarter this season. And so I think the fact that they've shown, even when things don't go great early in the game, they can eventually turn it on. Again, this week is probably going to be the most real adversity they've faced. I don't think Ohio State has faced any real adversity yet. But I think the fact that they were able to come out and finish as strong in the second half as they did against Iowa, I think that's certainly something that gives you confidence going into this week's game. But I do think a lot of it comes back to Will Howard. I mean, you're going in a tough road environment. The good thing with Will is this is a guy who's a 5th-year senior quarterback. He's played a lot of road games. He's played in a lot of big environments. So you feel better having an experienced guy going into a game like this than you do with a young quarterback who's never played in a game like this before. You don't expect him to be, deer in the headlights. You don't expect the moment to be too big for him. But this is going to be the best pass defense he's faced. I mean, this is a Oregon secondary that's strong. They're allowing less than 5.5 yards per passing attempt this season. They rank 9th in the FBS in yards allowed per passing attempt, just behind Ohio State, which ranks 8th. And so this is going to be the biggest test for Will Howard in terms of, being able to find open receivers, being able to throw receivers open. We mentioned it's a really good pass rush up front, so he's going to have to be able to make more throws under pressure than he has in every game this year. I've seen enough from Will Howard to feel reasonably confident in his ability to handle this moment. But again, we haven't seen him in this situation yet at Ohio State. If you do look at his history going back to his freshman year at Kansas State, he is just 6-9 in road games as a starter. So I think he's certainly got something to prove in this game. And how he performs in this game, you talk about a measuring stick, maybe more than anybody. How he performs in this game is going to dictate the kind of confidence that Ohio State fans have in him going into the rest of the season.
I think the thing about this Oregon secondary is they force you to execute with a lot of precision. I think Day and Kelly kind of touched on it today about how they never seem to really be like guys are never wide open against this secondary. It's always kind of in close, in phase with the defensive backs. And one number that I think kind of backs that up is this Oregon team is second in the nation in pass breakups. They get their hands on a lot of balls. They're in there with the receivers fighting. And so they haven't played any receiving core like Ohio State's because no other team in the country has a receiving core like Ohio State's. So they're the best in the business at getting open. But that is going to force Will to be accurate with his throws, and we've seen accuracy in a lot of stretches from him, but it's also going to force him to make great decisions. This Dan Lanning defense is going to change the picture for him a lot. Mixed coverages, mixed rushes, mixed fronts. They do a lot of different things in that area, and he's done it since he was Georgia's defensive coordinator and ran one of the best defenses in college football history in 2021. So this is a challenge in the secondary, I think. In the total, we've talked about Will being – he doesn't need to be superhuman for Ohio State because of all the weapons around him and also now because of the strides on the offensive line. But he does need to take care of the football. He needs to be a good decision maker, and he needs to be precise and accurate. And those three things all become harder against this secondary and against this pass rush too, I think. In that execution element, making the right reads in the RPO game, knowing who to go to, recognizing coverages, these things that all go into quarterbacking. It's going to be a holistic test for him, I feel like. And again, to your point, Dan, played in big games before, played in hostile environments before, certainly has a lot of experience, but it's different with national title stakes. It's different with Big Ten title stakes, and that's what comes into this game. Maybe less so on the former because Ohio State could lose this and still get back to the playoff as long as they don't drop a couple more. But this is a top 3 matchup. He didn't experience any of those at Kansas State. So there's a different level of intensity that comes with that. But also, again, he does have experience. He's been on the road plenty of times before. Autzen will be raucous. And I think to your point about starting fast, that's always a good way to silence a road crowd, as if you can come out and build a lead early, kind of just lower the energy in the stadium a little bit. It makes it easier to communicate and execute and things of that nature on offense.
And he said it Tuesday. He came to Ohio State to play in these games, or at least this is a part of a reason why he chose to come to Ohio State was to play in these kind of games. And Ohio State brought him in for these kind of games. They brought him in because they wanted to have an experienced hand guiding the offense in these kind of games. And so, again, this will be, the test for him to see what he can do on this stage. As you said before, it seems like a possibility that Ohio State could have the advantage running the ball against this defense. Again, against easily the best running back they faced because he's probably the best running back in the country. Oregon allowed Ashton Jeanty to have a big day. In total, Boise State had 221 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns on 6.7 yards per carry. And so that could be a blueprint for Ohio State to be able to follow in this game. Now, against the 4 other teams Oregon has played, they've held their opponents to 71.5 yards per game and 2.7 yards per carry. So again, I think you don't want to just look at one game. I don't know that you necessarily want to look at that Boise State game and go, yeah, Oregon's run defense isn't any good, because they've been really good against everyone else they've played. But it does show they're at least susceptible. And again, the other teams they played did not have one back, let alone two, the caliber of Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson. And so if this offensive line can continue to play the way it's played, you would think Ohio State is going to be able to have some success moving the ball on the ground. There was clearly a concerted effort to get Will Howard going in the quarterback run game this past weekend as well, which I think suggests that's something they want to have in their arsenal for this game against Oregon. And so I think in an ideal world for Ohio State, you start fast, you are able to move the ball on the ground early, and you are able to run to set up the pass. And if you can do that, then you can take pressure off of Will Howard's shoulders. You're hoping that, your run game will be effective to where you don't need Will Howard to do a lot of spectacular things in this game. You just need him to manage the offense consistently and make smart decisions. And I think probably the most important thing for Will Howard is avoiding mistakes like that interception we saw against Iowa, like that interception we saw against Michigan State. It seems like he's had a tendency to once or twice a game make a head-scratching decision that sometimes leads to a turnover. Other than that, like, his decision-making's been really good. I think he's done a really good job of going through his progressions. He's shown that he can throw the ball with accuracy, especially in the short to intermediate areas. Hasn't been great as a deep passer, so you're probably hoping you don't have to take a ton of deep shots in this game, but he's shown at least capable of doing that. I mean, you look at like the throw he had, the intermediate throw on the touchdown to Emeka Buka. I mean, that was an elite throw that he made against Iowa on Emeka Buka's second touchdown. So he has the capability to make big plays. You hope that you don't need him to do a ton of spectacular things himself, because that would mean that your run game is working. But in a game that I think we both expect to be tight in the fourth quarter, he needs to at least have that capability to make a couple of big throws. And this is certainly a game where you need to make Oregon's defense at least take your ability to throw the ball down the field seriously.
If you connect on one deep shot, that's all it takes. And I think Jeremiah Smith has the ability to really be that guy where, F it, Jeremiah down there somewhere. You might do once or twice in this game. Like, unless it's into double coverage or something, take that shot at some point. It's going to be there. And he turns 50 balls into 70, 30, 80, 20 balls, right? So this is, you connect on one of them, it opens up so many other things for the offense, because now those safeties have that just split second of hesitation where it's like, okay, I got to stay back a little bit and respect that part of the game. I can't just come out and defend the underneath stuff, the sideline stuff. I do, again, to your point, expect Chip Kelly to open the playbook a lot and do more to stretch the defense horizontally. We've seen plenty of it. The first 5 games, the screen game has been a huge part of that. Outside zone plays and outside run plays and shotgun toss and these things have also provided some of that stretch horizontally to a defense, but I think there's more you can get into in the playbook with those kinds of things. You saw one example, new play I saw against Iowa that they ran. They had Will Howard under center and ran a wide receiver quick with Jeremiah Smith coming across the field, handed off behind, turned into a really nice gain. They've obviously they scored on the end around to Jeremiah against Michigan State, but that was new to do it under center and show that motion coming across the field, which I think was intentful, because you come out under center and see that motion. Now, if you're Oregon, the light bulb goes off. If I'm a defender, oh, I saw that in film, and now maybe you can do a different action off of that. So all these little seeds that are planted, this is why I love the nuts and bolts and the chess match of football, and I think it's going to be a beautiful chess match between Chip Kelly and that Dan Lanning defense on Saturday.
I think if you're looking for reasons to be optimistic about Ohio State going into this game, I think one that does look promising for the Buckeyes is the situational football battle and where Ohio State has performed really well in some of those situations, even relative to Oregon. And I think a big one that stands out is red zone efficiency, because Ohio State has scored on every red zone possession this year. They have 20 touchdowns and 1 field goal in 21 trips to the red zone. Oregon, on the other hand, ranks 94th in the country in red zone scoring percentage, 45th in red zone touchdown percentage with 14 touchdowns, 3 field goals. And the advantage that Ohio State appears to have in the red zone flips to the other side of the ball as well, because Ohio State has allowed just 3 touchdowns in the red zone. They've only allowed opponents into the red zone 5 times, but they've allowed only 3 touchdowns, 0 field goals. They rank 3rd in the FBS in opponent red zone scoring percentage. Oregon, on the other hand, ranks 105th in opposing red zone scoring percentage, 68th in red zone touchdown percentage, with 7 touchdowns and 4 field goals allowed in 12 tries. And you think about what this game is going to be, at least what I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be a 1-score game, probably very likely a less than 3 or 4 point game. The difference between a touchdown and a field goal in the red zone could absolutely make or break the difference between winning and losing this game. And so when you see those numbers for Ohio State, I think that's one thing that gives me confidence to think if Ohio State can continue to be as effective as it's been in the red zone on both sides of the ball. And again, big if, because this is the best team Ohio State has faced. But if Ohio State can have that actual advantage in the red zone in this game, that could make the difference between winning and losing this game.
Absolutely. I had a wise coach once tell me that any football game that's reasonably close, for all the analysis, for all the talk and all the complexities that go into football, can usually be boiled down to a handful of plays. And Ohio State's coaches have said similar things before. That's why situational football is so important. That's why punching it in on 3rd and goal or getting that red zone touchdown instead of that field goal is so critical. And I think 3rd down is also a huge example of that. Converting 1 3rd down and then you eventually score a touchdown on a drive versus getting off the field could also be the difference in this game. I think Ohio State's done great situationally this year, and that's been a real strength for them. And you mentioned red zone being a huge advantage for Ohio State relative to Oregon. Not as huge, but they do have a better 3rd down rate on both offense and defense than the Ducks. I think turnovers are an area where Ohio State has a significant advantage, +4 turnover margin on the year versus Oregon's -1. And most of it is because Ohio State's defense has forced more turnovers than Oregon's has. The offensive giveaway numbers are similar, but Ohio State's defense this year, turnovers were a huge point of emphasis, and they forced 9 so far. That's in the top quarter of the country, the higher end of the. They're not like number 1 in forcing turnovers in the country, but they are up there relative to Oregon. And I think maybe some of the mistakes you could force from this offense, and maybe you change the picture on Dylan Gabriel and get him to make a mistake. If you can get a turnover in this game, or you get 2 and give 1 away, winning the turnover battle is massive. And I think if you're looking for 2 areas that could decide the game, just numbers wise, I think red zone efficiency, like you pointed out, is going to be huge on both sides. I think the turnover battle is going to be huge in determining the outcome of this game, especially when you talk about on the road. Turnovers can generate such a huge boost of momentum for the home team. So those are 2 areas I think you look at and you say Ohio State could have an advantage in these. And if they do, it can go a long way in determining the outcome of the matchup game.
As I mentioned earlier, Ohio State is going to have to break a trend for Big Ten teams making long road trips so far this year. Overall, Big Ten teams are just 2-10 this season in games when traveling across 2 or more time zones this year. Of course, this is happening a lot more often in the Big Ten this year because this is the first year of the Big Ten having West Coast teams with Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA. The first time Ohio State has to do it. Actually, the first time Ohio State will play a regular season game on the West Coast since 2013 when Urban Meyer's Buckeyes went to Cal. They were supposed to go to Oregon in 2020, but we all know what happened in 2020 with the non-conference schedule and such. And so this is going to be a new experience for Ryan Day and for his Buckeyes. But when I asked Ryan Day on Tuesday about if he was concerned about those numbers on the long road trip, he seemed very unconcerned.
Yeah, I don't really see it as much of a challenge that way. I think it's a 4.5-hour flight. It's a couple hours more than Nebraska, and we're going to stay on East Coast time, and I think we got a good plan. we're going to stay on our time schedule, and it, the way that, with the time of the game and everything fits kind of how we practice. So, we're not going to look too much into it.
Now, giving some context to those numbers, when you look at the games that the Big Ten teams have lost, those 10 games, only 2 of them was the team that lost actually favored to win those games. That was actually USC in both of those games. USC's lost to Michigan on the road and lost to Minnesota on the road. And so Ohio State coming into this game as a 3.5-point betting favorite last I checked on Tuesday afternoon. Ohio State, of course, being better than all these teams that have lost road games so far in the Big Ten this year as the number 2 team in the country. And so those teams' struggles are not necessarily analogous to Ohio State because of the fact that Ohio State is a better team than those teams that have lost games, and in many cases a significantly better team. But Oregon is also a better team than most of the teams that have won those games, excluding Oregon themselves, hosting Michigan State at Autzen Stadium. And when you look at Oregon's track record of success at Autzen Stadium, I do think that when you're thinking about this game, the road versus home factor is not something that can be discounted here. I mean, especially just looking at college football in general. I mean, you look at what happened this past week, the amount of massive upsets that happened even close to home road games, with Vanderbilt beating Alabama and Arkansas beating Tennessee and Texas A&M thumping Missouri. It is harder to win on the road than it is to win at home. That it does not mean that Ohio State cannot win this game, but it does add another variable that Ohio State has to overcome, and what we expect is going to be a very competitive game, regardless of if it was being played at the Shoe, at Autzen Stadium, or somewhere else.
Yeah, it's weird because this is the first time in my Ohio State career covering Ohio State that you've had to talk about this scenario where they fly out for a weekend trip and have to play a team on the West Coast. I've covered games on the West Coast before, Rose Bowl, those sorts of things, but you in a bowl trip, you get a week to adjust your sleep schedule and figure things out. And the strategy of flying out there Friday mid-morning and maintaining the East Coast schedule is interesting. You read about what causes jet lag, which is funny. I just think like these are things you don't normally think about, right? Like what causes jet lag, what throws a player off. Sleep is going to be an important factor for this Ohio State team. Like you have to stay on your circadian rhythm. That's your body's day-night cycle, kind of your internal clock, right? Of you go to bed at this time typically and wake up at this time typically. It's going to be, you're going to have to go to bed 3 hours earlier on a West Coast clock than you did on the East. And so, figuring that part of it out and making sure your players are properly rested, properly adjusted, maybe the travel, just like having that long flight doesn't weigh you down kind of a thing, is going to be an interesting part of this. It's just fun to kind of consider and think about, like, because this isn't a video game. You don't get to just plug your players in. And I think that's something people always forget when you're watching athletes is like these guys may have had a bad week. It's in their social lives or their family lives, may have not slept well, maybe under the weather to some extent, maybe haven't eaten right. Like Ohio State does as good a job as anyone in the country of managing player nutrition, player sleep, all that stuff. But it's going to be important. It's going to be important for this game that the team is properly rested in terms of sleep and properly adjusted to whatever extent they need to be at their best physical condition going into this game. Because, again, any small deviation in that sense could be the difference in the outcome. And to your point, again, it's just categorically harder to play on the road than it is at home. And I had trouble picking the winner of this game for a while because I wasn't sure. Like if this were played in the Shoe or played in a neutral site, would have been Ohio State in a heartbeat. But this game becomes a lot. There's a lot more that goes into this game beyond just what's on the field and how good each team is. You have to factor in Autzen and the travel.
Yeah, I can tell you that my circadian rhythm is probably not going to be on point for this game because I think the flight lands in Portland at like 12:45 a.m., which is 3:45 a.m. Eastern time. So I might be a little bit jet lagged, a little bit tired on Saturday. I will do my best to forge through it, but I know it's like, even for me, it's like, sometimes these road trips you don't get as much sleep as you should, and it makes it harder to do your job. And I'm not having to do a physically demanding job of running at full speed and tackling or getting hit for 3 hours. So I can only imagine if you have any deviation in your sleep, in your nutrition, and whatever, how that could affect you in a game like this. If this game was against UCLA, we wouldn't be talking about this because we would just assume they're going to be fine because UCLA isn't very good. It's because we're talking about a team that is really good in Oregon that, these little things have the potential to make the difference. We'll get into our predictions in just a few minutes, but before we get into that, Andy, what do you see for Ohio State to win this game? What do you see as the number one key to the game for the Buckeyes?
I think the matchup that is pivotal is Ohio State's defensive tackles against Oregon's interior offensive line, because I think that's where I could see the biggest mismatch occurring on Ohio State's side in their favor. Tyleek and Ty, those two played awesome last week. And Ty especially, man, 5 tackles, a strip sack. Like, those two are a fantastic defensive tackle tandem. And can they sustain it for 4 quarters if Ohio State shortens the rotations, right? We talked about it earlier. I think that this Oregon interior offensive line has some inexperience. Their center is a first-year starter, and we saw in his second year, and we saw how much that of a struggle that can be with Carson Hinsman at Ohio State last year. And they had to move who was their left guard last year. He's playing right guard now, and he's had some issues. So I think that interior offensive line of Oregon versus Ohio State's defensive tackle tandem, if you can stop Oregon's running game, which has been pretty inconsistent this year, average 3 yards per carry or less in those first 2 games, have had a couple better games since, but even a couple weeks ago, they only had 4.3 yards per carry. And so that Oregon running game has been inconsistent. If you can force them to become one-dimensional through really good defensive tackle play, getting penetration, that can be the difference, I think, and just getting that extra stop that you need. I think on the offensive side, it's going to come down to the pass protection, giving Will Howard, giving those guys time to work in the receiver room and get open. I think Josh Fryer, this is a huge test for him, whether against Mateo Uiagalelei or Jordan Birch. Those are 2 guys that are really going to test him. So I think for me, it comes down to the trenches. Big surprise. Can the defensive tackles dominate for Ohio State and kind of take over in some situations and really win? And then on the offensive side, can you hold up and do what you need to do against Oregon's pass rush to give these guys some time? Defensively, too, I would throw back in, again, those quick passes over the middle and how you defend them against this tight end and against this receiver trio for Oregon. How you defend that is also going to be key. So those are the 3 things I think that I'm watching for in this game as keys to victory for Ohio State.
Yeah, even though it's a completely different matchup than last week, I think that key that we talked about last week is just as important this week of, can you win the ground game? When you have the ball on offense, I think if you can run the ball consistently, if you can put together drives of your ground game, I think that's going to go a huge way in this game, because I think the more you can take your offensive line out of those situations where they're going to have to pass protect for a long time, the better off you're going to be. I'm more confident in Josh Fryer moving people in the ground game and running the ball than I am with him having to hold up one-on-one against Jordan Birch in pass protection. And so I think if you can get your run game going on offense, I think that's going to go a long way toward Ohio State's chances of winning this game. If this becomes a game where you have to put the ball in Will Howard's hands to make a lot of big throws down the stretch, my confidence in Ohio State winning this game drops. And so I think the ability to run the ball throughout the game and to be able to take pressure off of your passing game and your pass protection, to me, I think that's a big key for Ohio State. And then again, flipping it to the other side, I think the more you can put Dylan Gabriel and that Oregon offense into situations where they have to hold onto the ball, they have to throw the ball down the field, it's third and long, and you can give your pass rushers a chance to tee off. I think that is going to certainly be a recipe that you want if you're the Ohio State defense. I think if you allow them to, pick you apart and drive efficiently down the field, then, it could be a long day for you as Ohio State. But I think if you can, make stops on first and second down, if you can put Oregon into situations where it's going to have to hold up against your pass rush, I think Ohio State will be able to get home against the quarterback. I think it can force Dylan Gabriel into making some mistakes that can allow Ohio State to have a chance to flip this game in its favor. And so, I think those two things are important. And something we haven't talked about yet, but we should mention too, special teams are going to be crucial in this game too. I mean, we've seen in big games like this in recent years, we've seen Ohio State, some of those games, Ohio State lose them in part because their special teams made mistakes. This is an Oregon team. You look at their only real competitive game of this year, or at least game that came down to the wire, was that Boise State game. They had a kick return touchdown and a punt return touchdown in that game. So you can't let Oregon make game-changing plays in the return game, and you've got to execute consistently. We haven't seen Jaden Fielding in a lot of spots where they need him to make a big field goal. This could be the kind of game where you need him to do that. And so I think special teams is going to be an important factor in this game as well. You don't necessarily have to do anything spectacular on special teams to win the game. It'd be great if you did, but I don't think you have to. But you can't lose the game on special teams. I think that's something we've seen Ohio State do sometimes in recent years. They can't allow that to happen in this game. One player, Andy, if you had to pick one player who's an X factor for Ohio State in this game, who do you go with?
I'm going to go with Carnell Tate in his return. Great defenses are great at, or even just really good defenses are great at taking away the guy that they don't want to beat them, or maybe the two guys that they don't want to beat them. And I think this secondary is good enough that if they shade Emeka, if they shade Jeremiah, they can take one of those away. I really think Carnell is as good as you get at number 3 as a receiver in the country. We've talked about that before. And he's a guy that if Oregon focuses too much on those other two, can really do some great things in the passing game and has been a weapon as a blocker on the perimeter in the screen game too. Versatile, can move around formations. I think that to me is a guy that it's kind of back of mind a lot in this Ohio State offense, and that could play to his benefit because he's a really good receiver and has shown to be a really good receiver when he has gotten his targets this year.
I'm going to go with Caleb Downs. This is the kind of game that's why you brought in Caleb Downs. This is the kind of game where you need a guy like Caleb Downs at the back end of that defense. And, this is the first offense Ohio State has really faced, but they're going to be able to consistently test you in both the pass and the run game. That's where a guy like Caleb Downs can be so crucial. His ability to take away that middle of the field in coverage, as well as what we've really seen from him as he's been, activated the last couple of weeks, coming downhill, making big plays, blowing up run plays, blowing up screens. This is the kind of game where you need Caleb Downs to be at his best. This is the kind of game where I think the impact Caleb Downs can make from that safety position could make a difference between winning and losing the game. And so I think Caleb Downs is going to be a really important player for this defense. And I think there's a chance we come out of this game on Saturday saying, man, getting Caleb Downs in the transfer portal is one of the reasons why Ohio State wins this game. If Ohio State does in fact win this game, Andy, I think you've tipped your pick a little bit about where you're going on this game, but I'll ask you straight up now. Does Ohio State win? What's your level of confidence that Ohio State will win, and what is your ultimate score prediction?
Yes, my confidence level has risen in the last week just because I always think football comes down to the trenches more than anything, and I think Ohio State has an advantage overall. Oregon's D-line versus Ohio State's O-line is pretty close, honestly, with the strides Ohio State's offensive line has made, and we're going to get a real test in pass protection at the very least, looking at what Boise State was able to do running the football. And I like Oregon's defensive tackles and linebacker core, but this interior offensive line for Ohio State especially has been a real strength running the football, the whole offensive line really, running the football in particular, right? And so I think Ohio State has a real advantage D-line versus O-line on the defensive side of the ball. So for me, I have my score as Ohio State 34, Oregon 27. I mentioned before, tipping my pick, obviously, that I think Ohio State is going to win this game. Would win this game by multiple scores if it were at home or at a neutral site. But at Autzen, and with all the travel considerations, it is going to have a little bit of a factor. I think it deflates the margin a little bit. But I have 34-27 Ohio State winning by a touchdown. I kind of floated in between 3 to 7 points as the margin for my pick. But I do think that advantage in the trenches, the experience that Ohio State has, is going to be important on the road. And the situational successes that they've had this year, red zone, third down, turnovers, like we talked about earlier, all those somewhere in that mesh of factors situationally too. I think Ohio State's going to win on a key player to be able to pull out this victory. My overall level of confidence, again, with all the travel that you think about, and Oregon's a really good team, and you're on the road, and you can ultimately afford to lose this game. If you're Ohio State. Not that you should ever enter a game thinking like that, but you ultimately can. I would put my level of confidence at about 65% right now. I'm more confident than not, but there's definitely part of me that's like, Oregon could go out and win this game.
Yeah, I'm right around 50%, to be honest. I mean, I've really gone back and forth over the last couple of days on who I'm going to pick to win this game. I mean, I said before the year I picked Oregon to win this game. I said a few weeks ago when I did my updated Big Ten record projections on the website, but I was still picking Oregon to win this game. And I don't know that anything has, really changed in my evaluation of these two teams to where it's like, oh, I'm so much more confident now that Ohio State will win this game than I was 3 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago when I was saying I think Ohio State's going to win the national championship, but I'm not sure if they're going to win this game. And the biggest reason for that is the fact that, it is on the road. It's hard to win on the road. It's hard to win every game. I mean, you see what's happening. Alabama losing to Vanderbilt. I mean, Tennessee losing to Arkansas. I mean, good teams sometimes lose to teams that are not as good as them. And so while I think Ohio State is the better all-around team, although I say I think, I don't know, because we haven't seen Ohio State play a team of this caliber. So I think Ohio State is the better team than Oregon. I don't know that because we haven't seen Ohio State play a true matchup game like this yet. But I do think Ohio State is the better all-around team. Like you said, I think Ohio State's defensive line could have an advantage against Oregon's offensive line. I think as good as Oregon's offensive weapons are, I think Ohio State's are even better. And so I do think Ohio State has some advantages in this game. I think the biggest advantage I see for Ohio State is what we talked about before with the red zone efficiency that these teams have had. And when I started thinking about score predictions, I said to myself, okay, I don't think Ohio State's going to cover. I'm not picking Ohio State to cover because I think this is going to be a 3-point game or less. I think it's going to be that close of a game. I think this is going to be a game. I think there's going to be at least one lead change in the fourth quarter. I think it's going to come down to that final drive and who can make a play on either side of a ball to go out and win or lose the game. When I started thinking about all that and factoring that into a score prediction, you start thinking about, okay, this could be the difference between a field goal or a touchdown versus 2 field goals. And you look at those red zone numbers and you go, well, Ohio State has done a great job of finishing off drives with touchdowns this year. They've also done a great job of not allowing their opponents to finish drives with touchdowns this year. And when I thought about that, that's where I ultimately came to in my final score prediction. And I have Ohio State 28, Oregon 27. Same Oregon score as you, not quite as many points for Ohio State, but I think Ohio State's ability to finish with touchdowns and to hold opponents. I think Oregon is going to have some drives in this game. I don't think Ohio State's defense is going to look invincible in this game. I think Oregon is going to put together some drives, but this Ohio State defense has been really good at not allowing drives to turn into touchdowns. I think this Ohio State defense is going to be able to do that a few times, and I think that might make the difference for Ohio State to win a very close game. And so because of that, I am going with Ohio State 28, Oregon 27.
You had loosely mentioned to me last week that you were thinking about a 1-point margin for this game, and I think it's apt just to say that this will be a really close game, and it's going to come down to a few plays. I totally agree with that assessment. I don't really see a blowout happening in either direction. If it does, obviously I would expect it to be Ohio State that does it, but that's I'm expecting a great game. I won't be there. I'll be watching from home, but Dan and our lovely photographer Garrick will be on the road there in Eugene, ready to take this one in. I'm excited to watch the great football game though, and it's going to be a weird thing for me to be on the couch watching an Ohio State game. That hasn't happened since I think 2021. I was covering the team the last 2 years. So, it's that I actually kind of look forward to that experience of just sitting on the couch, eating some snacks and working at the same time.
Yeah. To be clear, you will still be working. You will still
very much be working.
Yep, and you will still be covering the game, and will still be as much a part of our coverage plans as always. There's we have as a company, we have to make some smart budget decisions this year because we're hoping that we're going to get to go cover pre-college football playoff games, and that could be pretty expensive. And so we did have to make the business decision to limit our expenses by only having two of us travel to this game. But Andy will certainly be missed in Eugene, but we'll still be in constant communication, of course, as all of us at 11 Warriors will be providing tons of coverage of this Ohio State-Oregon matchup all week leading up to the game, during the game on Saturday night, and then after the game, all into next week. Ohio State has a bye next week, but I think win or lose, we are going to have plenty to talk about on next week's episode of Real Pod Wednesdays because games don't get a whole lot bigger than this. Number 2 versus number 3. I mean, we've talked about this game so much. We just spent over an hour talking about it again. I think we're excited to talk about it for a few more days and then actually watch this game, actually see it play out. It's going to be very exciting to watch the Buckeyes play in a top 3 matchup. These are the kind of games that it's all about. These are the kind of games that we get excited for, and it really can make or break a season. Yeah, it's a little bit different than some past years in the sense that this is not a CFP elimination game, but this game sure as heck still matters. And this is sure as heck a game that Ohio State wants to win, and Ohio State wants to go make a statement in as it closes out the first half of the season. And so lots more to come on 11warriors.com. And we hope you'll join us again next week on Real Pod Wednesdays.